Georgia, 1932. George Perry caught the world record largemouth bass, weighing in at 22 pounds, 4 ounces, which record still holds true today. One of the most popular game fish in the United States is the largemouth bass. There are seriously over hundreds of ways people catch them. Today I will share with you one of the most productive ways to catch number and size, often referred to as fishing for bass. According to Tim Tucker, a senior writer for Bassmaster magazine, he says, flipping was the most effective method ever introduced to the fishing world. Because Idaho is such a great place for these sought-after treasures, the largemouth bass, this is a great hobby for anyone to pick up. I have been fishing ever since I can remember, and I have studied bass behavior and technique in my spare time quite extensively to further improve my fishing skills. To explain the art of pitching for bass, I will talk about bass behavior, the equipment needed, and the proper techniques of pitching. To gain a general idea of what pitching for bass is, I will explain a little more in depth. Pitching is simply just the technique used to deliver the bait or the lure to the bass, and the jig is simply the lure or the bait that you're using. To fully understand the art of flipping a jig, we must first understand the behavior of bass. The behavior of bass, really, bass is an ambush predator. And I like to make the analogy of using a crocodile. You're not going to see a crocodile chase down a zebra and eat it. But the way a crocodile works is it lays inside the water, in the muddy water, and it waits for the zebra to come close. When the zebra comes close enough, then the crocodile bites the head off of the zebra. And that's basically how the largemouth bass works as well. The largemouth bass uses cover, which is, for example, like rocks, trees, brush piles, weeds, anything like that. The bass will sit there and hide inside this cover and wait for a bait fish to come by, and when the bait fish comes by, then it attacks it. Another bass behavior is bass is really an opportunistic feeder, which means if you place a injured bait fish in front of the bass, it's going to just psychologically, the bass is going to attack. It just has to. That's the way it works. So that's an advantage for an angler, by the angler using injured bait fish lures to put in front of the fish's face, and the fish is going to eat it. And then because flipping a jig is done in shallow water, it's important to know when the bass are going to be up in shallow water. And if there's cover in the shallow water, that means the bass is probably going to be there. If there's a fallen over tree, if there's a point that sticks out full of rocks, the bass is probably going to be on there. Also, where the bait fish are. If there's crawdads up shallow, if there's bait fish up shallow, you're probably going to find the bass up shallow as well. Also in the springtime is the spawn time for the bass, and they go up shallow as well. So in the springtime, it's a great time to pitch for bass because they're all up shallow spawning. Now that we know where to find a largemouth bass, we'll talk about the equipment needed. The equipment needed is quite simple and basic. You need a rod. There's two types of rods. There's a spinning rod and a bait casting rod. The spinning rod is used for light line, light jig, light lures. And the spinning rod is great for finesse, but for pitching, you're going to be in heavy cover and you're going to be up shallow. So the rod of choice would be a bait casting rod. The bait casting rod is just thicker, has more backbone, and it's great for pitching a jig. Now for the line. There's two types of line. There's monofilament and there is braid. Monofilament is great to use because it has great abrasion resistance, which means if you rub it along rocks, it's not going to break. If you rub it along a tree limb, it's not going to break. The downside to monofilament is that it has stretch, which means when a bass hits it, it's gonna be harder to detect. It's not going to be as line sensitive as they say. Braid, on the other hand, has no stretch, which means if a bass hits it, you're going to feel that hit, and it's really clear. The downside to braid is that when it touches a rock or a tree limb, when you rub it, or when it brushes against a rock, it breaks most of the time. So that's the downside of braid. Me personally, I like going with braid just because I can feel the fish so much clearer, and I try to stay away from the rocks. The next item for equipment needed is the reel. There's basically two types of reels. There's a spinning reel and a bait casting reel. Real simply, a bait casting reel fits on a bait casting rod, and a spinning reel fits on a spinning reel. So you don't want to mix those up, and you just want to keep it the same, and it works out great. The next equipment needed is the lure. And in this case, we're using a jig. And a jig, to explain it real quick, this is a jig right here. It's consisted of lead head and a weed guard right here to keep it from tangling up in weeds and wood. Then you got the skirt right here, and then the trailer, and that makes up the jig right there. And according to the Ultimate Fishing Resource Guide on the internet, he says stick to basic jig colors such as black and blue, brown and brown, or black and chartreuse. Now that we know what a jig is and the equipment needed to catch a bass, we'll talk about the proper techniques of pitching. And to pitch, it's really simple and quite easy to do. You just hold the bait in your left hand, the rod in your right, and you just guide the lure to where, since it's short range, you're just pinpointing, and you just guide it just like that. And then you just flip it down, and you can reel it in. And it's just real simple, and you just guide it like that. And that's the technique used for pitching. In conclusion, I have explained a little more in depth how to pitch for bass. I have explained bass behavior and the equipment used and the technique and approach to pitch a jig. I hope for those who fish to get this new approach to fishing a try, and for those who don't fish to pick up bass fishing as a hobby. I know that flipping is fun and a very effective way to fish, and that you'll catch many and probably catch the biggest one in the lake.